The champagne glass caught the light from the chandeliers above, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. 200 people in their finest clothes, sitting at tables draped in white linen, all of them staring at me, a 63-year-old woman in a blue dress she'd bought on clearance at Marshall's, as I slowly rose from my seat at the back of the room. My son's face had gone the color of chalk. My daughter-in-law gripped her husband's arm. But the man standing at the microphone, the man who had just said what he said in front of every person in that ballroom, he was the one whose expression I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Because when I reached into my purse and placed that folder on the table, Gerald Hartwell's mouth stopped moving for the first time in 30 years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, because this story doesn't make sense unless you understand where I came from. My name is Ruth. I grew up in Macon, Georgia, the youngest of 4 children, raised by a mother who ironed other people's shirts and a father who drove a delivery truck until his back gave out. I understood early that in our family, dignity was not something handed to you. You built it yourself, with your hands, in the dark, when no one was watching. I married Thomas when I was 22. He was a pipe fitter, the kind of man who smelled like metal and soap at the end of every day, who kept a worn leather Bible on his nightstand and always saved the last bite of dessert for me. We weren't wealthy. We weren't even comfortable, not by anyone else's definition. But we were steady, and in those first years of our marriage, steady felt like everything. Daniel came along 18 months after our wedding. Thomas held that baby like he was made of something precious, and honestly, he was. From the moment my son opened his eyes in that delivery room, I knew he was going to be extraordinary. I just didn't know yet what it would cost me to make sure he had the chance to prove it. Thomas died on a Tuesday in March. Daniel had just turned 7. The official report said it was an accident, a valve malfunction on a worksite outside of Savannah. 3 men went down into that confined space that morning. Only 2 came back up. The company, Hartwell Industrial Solutions, one of the largest pipeline contractors in the Southeast, expressed their deepest condolences and offered me a settlement. The lawyer they sent to my house wore a suit that probably cost more than my car. He was very kind, very professional, and very clear. Sign here, and we'll take care of you. Don't sign, and we'll see you in court for the next 5 years while you try to raise a child on nothing. I signed. I should tell you that I didn't understand, at the time, what I was giving up. I was 29 years old. I was grieving. I had a 7-year-old boy asking me every morning when Daddy was coming home, and I didn't have the strength to fight a corporation that had entire floors of lawyers and 30 years of practice making things go away. So I took the money, I buried my husband, and I went back to work. For the next 22 years, I worked as a patient care technician at Piedmont Hospital in Atlanta. I took extra shifts when they were offered. I learned to clip coupons like it was an art form. I packed Daniel's lunch every single day of elementary school because the cafeteria cost money and peanut butter didn't. I told him his father had been a good man who worked hard and died doing something that mattered. I told him that every single time he asked, which was often, because Daniel was the kind of child who needed to understand why things happened. He needed the story to make sense. What I never told him was what I had found. 6 months after Thomas died, while I was sorting through some of his things I had stored in a box in the closet, I found a folded piece of paper tucked inside his work journal. It was a copy of an internal inspection report dated 2 weeks before the accident. Thomas had written in the margin, in his careful, deliberate handwriting, "This has to go to someone. They know and they're not fixing it." The report detailed a faulty pressure relief system on the exact site where he died. Someone had flagged it. Someone had signed off on the repair. Someone had lied. I hired a private attorney, not the one the company sent, a different one, a woman named Carol who worked out of a small office in Decatur and charged me $200 for the initial consultation, which I paid in cash. She looked at the document for a long time. She told me it was significant. She also told me that without a whistleblower inside the company willing to go on record, it would be nearly impossible to prove deliberate negligence rather than oversight. And going up against Gerald Hartwell, who had 3 generations of money and political connections throughout the state, was not a fight she could promise I would win. I put the report back in the box. I went home and made Daniel dinner. and I decided that justice could wait until I had the resources to demand it properly. The years passed the way they do when you are too busy surviving to notice time moving. Daniel grew tall and serious, the kind of teenager who read books without being told to and asked questions that embarrassed his teachers in the best possible way. He got a full scholarship to Georgia Tech. I stood in the parking lot after his acceptance letter arrived and cried so hard I couldn't catch my breath, not from sadness, but from the particular relief of watching something you sacrificed everything for finally become real. I gave him his father's watch at his high school graduation. It was a simple silver watch, nothing expensive, but Thomas had worn it every day for 12 years. I told Daniel that his father had believed in doing careful, precise work, that the watch was a reminder to pay attention, to not cut corners, to always know what time it was in the deepest sense. My son held it against his chest like I had handed him something sacred, because I had. He met Melissa in his 3rd year of law school. She was smart and beautiful and completely certain of herself in a way that I respected, even when it made me nervous. Her family was from Charleston old money, the kind that doesn't talk about money because it doesn't have to. Her father, Gerald Hartwell, had built an empire in pipeline contracting across the Southeast. He had a foundation named after him at 2 universities. He had given a wing to the Children's Hospital in Columbia. He was, by every public measure, a distinguished man. The first time I met him, at a dinner Melissa arranged at a restaurant I could never afford to eat at on my own, he shook my hand with the confidence of someone who had never once doubted their place in a room. He asked what I did. I told him I was a patient care technician at Piedmont. He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are calculating something rather than listening. Then he turned to Daniel. Forgive me, I still do that sometimes. He turned to my son and began talking about his plans for the firm's expansion into Tennessee. I noticed, in that moment, that I had ceased to exist at the table. I told myself it didn't matter. Rich people are often like that. They orbit themselves. What mattered was that my son was happy, that Melissa clearly loved him, that they were building something real together. I went home that night, made myself a cup of tea, and sat at my kitchen table for a long while, just breathing. But I also went to the closet. I took down that box. I looked at Thomas's handwriting again. The name on the inspection report, the supervisor who had signed off on the false repair confirmation, was a man named Dale Sutter. I had tried years ago to find Dale Sutter. He had left the company shortly after the accident. He had moved, or so I was told. The trail went cold. What I didn't know then, and what I discovered through 8 months of very quiet, very careful searching after that dinner at the restaurant, was that Dale Sutter had not simply left. He had been paid a significant sum, transferred through a subsidiary company, to relocate to Florida and sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. I found this out not through any dramatic detective work, but through a retired auditor named Frank, who I had taken care of during his hip recovery at Piedmont, who owed me a favor and who still had friends in the financial compliance world. Frank was 71 years old and had absolutely nothing to lose by helping a woman he liked find documents that a corporation had tried very hard to bury. It took us almost a year, but we found them. I want to be honest with you about something because I think it matters. When I finally held the full picture in my hands, the original inspection report, the wire transfer records, the legal agreement with Dale Sutter, and a memo from Gerald Hartwell himself, directing his operations manager to handle the situation quietly, I didn't feel triumphant. I sat at my kitchen table and I cried. Not for myself, for Thomas, for the 7-year-old boy who asked every morning when Daddy was coming home, for the years I had given to hospital floors and cafeteria fundraisers and clearance rack dresses, all while the man responsible for my husband's death went to charity galas and shook governors' hands. I didn't tell Daniel. I want you to understand why. My son had built his entire professional life on merit and integrity. He had clerked for a federal judge. He had turned down a higher-paying position at a corporate firm because he wanted to do work that meant something. If I had told him what I found, he would have been forced to make an impossible choice between the life he was building with Melissa and his loyalty to me and to his father's memory. He was 28 years old. That was not a weight I was willing to place on him. Not yet. Not until I knew exactly what I intended to do with what I had. So I waited. I found a journalist, a woman named Patricia, who had written extensively on corporate negligence for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and I made contact. I told her I had documentation. I told her I needed more time to get everything organized properly. She was patient. She was also very clear that when I was ready, this story would run. The graduation dinner was held at the Biltmore in Atlanta on a Saturday evening in June. Daniel had just passed the bar on his second attempt. He'd been devastated by the first failure in a way that I understood deeply, because in our family, there was no safety net, no family money to fall back on while you tried again. And Melissa's family had organized an elaborate celebration, 200 guests. The Hartwell family's friends, colleagues, law school classmates, everyone who mattered in their world. I was seated at a round table near the back, with two of Daniel's friends from college, and their wives, lovely people who made conversation easily and refilled my water glass without being asked. My son was at the head table. He kept looking over at me and smiling, that particular smile he's had since he was small, the one where his eyes go soft at the corners. He was wearing his father's watch. Gerald Hartwell gave the first toast. He was practiced at it, the confident pause, the self-deprecating joke to warm the room up, the pivot to something sincere. He talked about excellence and hard work and the values that his family had always believed in. He talked about Melissa and how proud she made him. Then he talked about Daniel. He said my son was a remarkable young man. He said that Melissa had chosen well. He said that Daniel had clearly been given a good foundation. And then he paused, and he looked directly at me. And he said, and these are his exact words, because I have replayed them enough times to know them perfectly, he said. Though I understand the foundation was a modest one, but polish and good company can do a great deal for a man. The room laughed softly. Not unkindly, most of them. They probably didn't even fully register what had been said. It was the kind of comment that slips through because it's wrapped in enough pleasantry that only the person it's aimed at understands the blade inside it. A woman who had spent 30 years as background noise in other people's spaces, I recognized it immediately. He had just told 200 people that my son had been poverty adjacent until the Hartwells elevated him. I looked at my son. Daniel had gone very still. Melissa was looking at her plate. I reached into my purse. I had brought the folder because Patricia had advised me to show it to Gerald directly and privately, before going to publication, to give him the chance to respond on record. That had been the plan, a quiet confrontation, a controlled process. I had not planned to do what I did next. But then, I had also not planned to sit at the back of a room while a man who let my husband die called our life modest with a smile on his face. I stood up slowly, the way you do when your knees aren't what they used to be and you want to be careful about it. Every head at my table turned, then the heads at the next table. There is something about a 63-year-old woman rising deliberately from her chair at the back of a ballroom that creates a particular kind of silence. I said, "I'm sorry to interrupt." My voice was steady. I surprised myself with that. Gerald Hartwell lowered his glass. He looked at me with the mild, polished irritation of a man who is very accustomed to being the only person who speaks at length. I said, "My name is Ruth. I am Daniel's mother. I worked as a patient care technician for 22 years to raise my son alone, after his father was killed on a worksite that your company failed to make safe." The room went absolutely quiet. I said, "I have spent the last several years confirming what I suspected for much longer, that the pressure relief system failure that killed my husband Thomas was flagged in an internal inspection report 2 weeks before the accident, that the required repairs were falsified, that a man named Dale Sutter was paid through a subsidiary account to relocate and sign a non-disclosure agreement, and that a directive to, and I'm quoting directly here, handle the situation quietly, was signed by you." I held up the folder. I did not open it. I didn't need to. Gerald Hartwell's face had already told me everything the room needed to see. His wife put her hand on his arm. He did not move. I said, "I want to be clear about something. I am not doing this for myself. I am doing this because my son has spent his entire adult life believing his father's death was an accident. He has lived with that grief, and he deserved to know the truth. And because there is a journalist with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution who has been waiting patiently for me to be ready. As of Monday morning, I am ready." I sat back down. The room stayed silent for what felt like a very long time. My son was looking at me. His eyes were full of something I couldn't entirely read: shock, yes, and grief, the fresh, raw kind that comes when something you thought you understood about your life suddenly shifts entirely, but underneath all of that, something else. Recognition, maybe. The look of a person understanding, for the first time, the full shape of a sacrifice they had only ever seen part of. He stood up from the head table. He crossed the entire length of that ballroom and came to where I was sitting. He knelt down beside my chair, which he has not done since he was small, and he took both of my hands in his, and he didn't say anything for a moment. He just held on. Then he said quietly, "Dad's watch." I nodded. He said, "You've been carrying this the whole time." I said, "I was waiting until I could do it right." Gerald Hartwell left the event shortly after. I was told later, by one of the catering staff who was apparently paying closer attention than most of the guests, that he made several phone calls in the parking garage before his car arrived. I imagine he did. There is a particular kind of phone call that wealthy men make when they realize the thing they buried has finally come back up to the surface. The story ran the following Thursday. Patricia had done extraordinary work. She'd found 2 additional former employees willing to speak on background, and the documentation Frank and I had assembled was, in her words, airtight. Hartwell Industrial Solutions issued a statement through their attorneys that same afternoon, calling the allegations without merit. By Friday, 2 investigative journalists from other outlets had picked up the story. By the following Monday, the Georgia Attorney General's office had announced they were looking into the matter. I'm not going to tell you that everything resolved cleanly and quickly, because that's not how justice actually works. What I will tell you is that it moved. It moved in a way that it never would have if I had stayed in my seat at the back of that room with my folder in my purse and my dignity quietly tucked away the way I'd been taught to keep it. Gerald Hartwell resigned from the boards of both universities where his name was on buildings. His company's federal contracting work was suspended pending investigation. Dale Sutter, now 73, and apparently tired of the particular exhaustion that comes with 30 years of silence, agreed to speak to investigators. That process is ongoing. None of that brings Thomas back. I want to say that plainly, because I think sometimes in these stories there is an expectation that justice, when it finally arrives, fills the hole that was left. It doesn't. I still reach for my phone sometimes to call him when something good happens. Old habits of the heart don't care what year it is. What changed is something quieter than justice and more permanent than revenge. My son knows who his father was now, not the softened version I gave him to protect him, but the full truth. A man careful enough to copy a report, brave enough to write in the margins, and unlucky enough to die before he could do anything about it. Daniel has a copy of that inspection report now, framed on the wall of his office. Next to a photo of Thomas, in his work clothes, the silver watch on his wrist, squinting into the sun. My daughter-in-law came to see me about 3 weeks after the event. She sat at my kitchen table, which no one from her world has ever done before, and she was quiet for a long time. Then she said that she hadn't known. I told her I believed her. She asked me if I hated her family. I told her that hatred was something I'd never been able to afford. It cost too much and kept you in place. What I wanted was accountability. And now the wheels of that were turning, and that was enough for today. She asked if I would come to Sunday dinner. I said yes. I want to close with something about the folder. After everything that happened, after the journalists and the Attorney General's office and the statement from Hartwell's lawyers, I finally sat down and sorted through all of it, every document, every transfer record, every piece of paper that Frank and Carol and I had assembled over those careful, quiet months. And at the very bottom of the stack, I found something I had forgotten was there. It was the original letter Thomas wrote. Not the inspection report, but a separate piece of paper, folded small, that must have been tucked behind it in the journal. 3 sentences, in his handwriting. Not addressed to anyone, just written the way you write something when you need to put it somewhere outside your own head. He had written, "The right thing and the easy thing are almost never the same thing. I know what I have to do. I just need a little more time." He never got the time. But I did. I keep the letter in the same box where I found it, on the shelf in my bedroom closet, next to a photo of the three of us at Daniel's 7th birthday party. Thomas, laughing, Daniel mid-jump, me, with my hand raised to shield my eyes from the sun. All of us caught in a moment so ordinary that no one thought to be careful with it. We didn't know, then, that it was one of the last ones. I know now that carrying something for a long time doesn't make you a martyr. It doesn't make you noble, either. It just makes you a person who decided that the truth was worth the wait. Some mornings that feels like strength. Some mornings it just feels like what I had to do because no one else was going to do it. But then my son calls. He says, "Good morning, Mom," in the voice that has been the best sound in my life for 36 years. And he asks how I slept, and whether I've eaten, and what my plans are for the day. And I think about Thomas's 3 sentences, and I think, we got the time, maybe not the way we imagined, but we got it. That is enough. That has always been enough.